Thank you so much, and thank you, JC and Congressman Pittenger for hosting this today. Thank you so much and for prioritizing this. The Interparliamentary Taskforce, as I wanted to mention, actually was birthed right here in PISF. It was actually Congressman Pittenger who really had the vision for wanting to bring in this topic of human trafficking because it is so crucial to everything we're talking about today. I'm actually going to reference some of the cybersecurity stuff, so I was really grateful that those statistics were brought up. I'm going to tie in some of that, so I will go pretty quickly. As I mentioned, I'm here today, but also Tanya Gould will be speaking after me. It is her birthday today. Happy birthday. And then Mary will be wrapping up, but all of what we're saying actually ties together. So at the end, we want to open it up for questions. We'll open it up after all three of us speak, so just let me know at that time. Okay, today is actually Anti-Corruption Day, International Anti-Corruption Day. And so I'm going to actually spend the next few minutes tying in this issue of how corruption facilitates, fuels, and fosters human trafficking. There have been many, many headlines in the past year, mostly focused actually on Southeast Asia, specifically describing thousands of people trapped inside massive compounds, forced to run online scams day and night. Many had responded to what looked like legitimate job offers. Actually, many are Uyghurs. So as most of you know, the Uyghurs who have been persecuted so greatly in China, put into forced labor camps. Those who have fled have often fled to Cambodia and parts of Southeast Asia, where unfortunately then they are caught up unintentionally in these forced scamming. So it's becoming a huge issue. Instead, their passports have been taken, they've been beaten, refused to work, if they refuse to work, and some were tortured in front of others as a warning. So I just want to paint the picture. This is very heavy, but this is a real crux of where a humanitarian issue meets a global security issue. They were not what most consider traditional human trafficking. There were no brothels. There were no border crossings in the way most people would normally imagine. This was forced labor inside cyber crime operations. People exploited to defraud victims here in the West, generating billions in profit. And this is why human trafficking is not just a humanitarian issue. It is a sophisticated transnational security threat. We often talk about human trafficking as a moral failure, and so I know people have different understandings of human trafficking and exploitation, so I'm actually going to unpack what it is for those of you who don't understand or have heard a lot of things. We're not referring to people crossing the border. That is not what we're referring to, so we're actually referring to something else. We often talk about it as a moral failure, as I mentioned, but exploitation fuels organized crime, destabilizes regions, corrodes governance, and intersects with conflict and cybercrime. Human trafficking thrives in the same environments that global security professionals worry the most about: weak governance, corruption, conflict, displacement, and economic instability. Where people are unprotected, exploitation follows. And where exploitation flourishes, organized crime embeds itself deeply into the fabric of a society. Human trafficking and exploitation is a vast economic global enterprise. It is low risk, it is high reward, and it is deeply, deeply adaptable. Unlike other forms of illicit trade, the commodity is human beings, and it is the fastest growing criminal enterprise in the entire world, the number one. As lawmakers and business leaders, you hold a very, very critical role in combating this evil. So oftentimes people with human trafficking like to actually focus on, rescue or recovery, but that is not enough. That is just playing whack-a-mole. Without changes to our laws and policies, many victims will never be identified or recovered. And actually the cycle will just continue. Human trafficking is defined, and this is like the legal definition, as the recruitment, transportation, or harboring of individuals through force, fraud, or coercion. And the ultimate goal is exploitation for profit. That's really what sets it apart from other forms of just exploitation or humanitarian issues. Exploitation, not to get into the technical definitions of it all, doesn't necessarily mean that someone profits from it. With human trafficking, someone is profiting. They are actually making money because it's a crime of financial gain. The crime knows no boundaries. As you'll see in a minute, we're going to talk about cybercrime. It is truly a borderless crime. It targets men, women, children, all ages, all races, all ethnicities. Traffickers employ various tactics. We'll get into a few of those, including, of course, violence. But they also employ fraudulent employment agencies, false promises, actually, of education. They all throughout, actually, the continent of Africa, they will target boys and girls from fairly stable families, like Ghana especially. We've helped a number of women there. They had gone to high school, they had graduated, they had loving, stable families, and they wanted to study abroad. And so they were lured, these women, thinking that they were going to go to Europe. And halfway through their journey, the person who held their passport said, "You can return home." Mind you, they had to pay their own ticket, and they didn't have the money to return home now. And they said, "Or you can continue on your journey, but you're going to end up in Iraq." And so they ended up in Iraq, and they were forced into forced slavery as indentured servants. That's a whole separate issue, but that is how this happens. People think it's just a few select people. It is happening by the millions. And so it's the rare few who actually get out. Trafficking does not operate alone. There are exploitation networks that overlap with arms trafficking, money laundering, drug trafficking, cybercrime, and financial fraud. These are not separate problems. They are completely interconnected parts of the same criminal ecosystem. And this is especially evident in situations of conflict. So I do want to mention that in war-torn and destabilized regions, which is where a lot of people think of this, human trafficking becomes a tool of power. Armed terrorist groups, specifically, such as the Taliban and ISIS, they use it to generate revenue. They use it to control populations and to perpetuate fear. Children are subject to forced labor, and often women and girls are kidnapped and then sold as sex slaves or into forced marriages. And this is happening throughout Africa as well as the Middle East, of course. Human trafficking is big business. At the end of the day, it is big business. And unlike any other human rights abuse, it funds illicit networks and movements that threaten the security of our entire world. As one example from the Southern Hemisphere, from below the United States, MS-13, one of the most notorious gangs operating. They operate largely in Guatemala, here in Central America, Honduras, El Salvador. In 2015, the U.S. Treasury Department found, quote, and this is a quote from them, "Money generated by local MS-13 cliques engaged in sex trafficking, drug trafficking, murder for hire, extortion, and money laundering." And it was, quote, "consolidated and funneled to the group's central leadership in Central America." All of these factors contribute to a heightened risk of human trafficking, especially for children in this region. So as you can see, this is truly a global issue. The profitability and repeatable nature of trafficking make it particularly attractive to organized crime. A single victim can be exploited multiple times. So unlike a gun, which you can sell once and it's done, you can sell a person over and over again. It generates far more revenue than a shipment of narcotics or illicit arms deal. Addressing trafficking is therefore not only a moral and humanitarian imperative, but it's actually a critical counterterrorism and anti-crime strategy. Human trafficking doesn't just result, as we know though, from conflict or from mass migration, which is often what people think. Those factors definitely are pull factors for increasing it, but that's not it. The profits from exploitation actually fund violence, prolong instability, and undermine overall peace-building efforts. And in this way, it becomes both a symptom and actually a driver of insecurity. Also, I want to now dive into the technology side. It has dramatically accelerated these risks. Today, human trafficking, recruitment, grooming, and exploitation and the payment increasingly occurs online. Digital platforms. In fact, right now in the Senate, there is an all-day hearing, which I highly encourage you to tune into, very bipartisan, in the Senate Judiciary Committee today. It's actually an all-day hearing specifically on one topic, and that is online child exploitation. It's huge. It is a huge, huge issue, and there are a plethora of bills. In fact, I was sitting there, 3 new bills were just introduced, a whole package on that topic alone, because it's such a huge intersection. Online sexual exploitation in particular has normalized extreme violence and generated massive illicit profits with limited accountability. Digital exploitation is not only a social harm, it also is a security challenge because it intersects, as our previous speakers mentioned, cybersecurity, financial crimes, and transnational criminal operations. The digital battlefield now includes human exploitation. And while traffickers and systems often take center stage, the long-term security impact is shaped by what happens to survivors. Human trafficking shatters individuals, just to give you a look behind the scenes. So we're dealing with not only the security angle, but what happens in a society when you have a massive amount of children who have actually been exploited online. What does that do to an entire society or community? So human trafficking shatters individuals and communities. Survivors frequently return, of course, with profound trauma, criminal records, economic exclusion, and little access to justice. Without restoration and support, many are vulnerable to re-exploitation and coercion into criminal activity. And that's why one of the most important bills actually that we have recently passed here in Congress happened just last week on Monday. It was the Trafficking Survivors Relief Act. And while people think that's great, what it does is it provides a pathway for criminal record relief for survivors of trafficking, most of whom have been involved in things like money laundering and bank fraud. So they were actually victims themselves of money laundering or bank fraud right here in the United States of America, and then they're charged with that crime, given a felony conviction, so that not only can they not just vote, they have difficulty getting a job. They have difficulty getting an apartment. I talked to one woman, she literally worked for the NSA and then lost her job when it came through, and she was the victim. And the judge stood there and said, you're clearly a victim of human trafficking, but this is what the law says. That should not be, and that's happening all across the world. And so the United States, just so you know, if you're from another country, we are truly leading on this. In fact, at the United Nations, this was mentioned just a few weeks ago, that we are leading in the United States with this criminal record relief. 48 out of the 50 states have passed some version of it, and we anticipate that this will pass into law as early as this month. It just needs to clear the Senate. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. That is something that a lot of people throughout the world experience, and we call it, if you Google it, it's called the principle of non-punishment. So it's a new type of legislation that you can look into. On a societal scale, this erodes resilience. It fractures families and communities. You cannot have stable nations while exploitation leaves generations upon generations marginalized and unprotected. Global estimates indicate that a staggering 50 million people are subject to exploitation through human trafficking, yet fewer than 0.5%, actually it's 0.4%, are ever identified. There are more slaves on the planet right now than at any other time in human history. And the suffering endured by these sustains an industry, and this is where the statistic comes in, of $236 billion annually. I've actually heard estimates higher that go above the $300 billion mark. So I know there was a slide that had been put up during the previous talk, and it listed all these different types of cyber crimes. This absolutely fits in there. So I just wanted to mention that. It makes it the second largest criminal enterprise in the entire world. It actually is only surpassed right now by drug trafficking specifically. So the moral cost of inaction is obviously immense, but so is the strategic cost. Dependence on exploitive supply chains is not just an ethical concern, and this is where I'm going to tie in the last little bit on China. It is a security vulnerability. In July of 2022, just after the start of the war with Ukraine, the FBI director, actually we were we were over there in Romania when they made this announcement. It was actually at one of these PISF forums, and it happened that very day. The FBI director and the MI5 director general delivered a joint statement noting that China, quote, poses the biggest long-term threat to Western security. It was a rare joint statement in person. And they said this because the whole world was so focused on Russia at the time, and they wanted to make it clear. So I just want you to know this is how it all ties in. But the supply chains that actually originate in China, and this is for all the business leaders in the room, come from forced labor camps of the Uyghur people. They further strengthen the economy of our largest threat and provide a global security concern that extends beyond human rights. So we could dive into so much more on that, but as I close, I want to wrap up with how you can learn more about this. It is a humanitarian disaster. It is a global security threat. It is one of the fastest growing criminal enterprises in the world, but history shows us that courageous lawmakers, informed by the experience of survivors, can drive systemic change. We see this all throughout history. William Wilberforce in the 1800s, who ushered in the beginning of the end of the transatlantic slave crisis, was a lawmaker. The tipping point is within reach, but only if legislators take the lead. And this is why the Interparliamentary Taskforce on Human Trafficking that I lead actually created this year. We call it the ATIP Policy Library, so it stands for Anti-Trafficking in Persons. It is a free digital online library of very key synthesized anti-trafficking legislation from around the world. So you can go on there right now. You just go to Taskforce, Taskforce, on HT. HT stands for human trafficking. So just Taskforce on HT.org, and you can pull it up. You just click the link and scroll down to library, and you can see this is a synthesized list of what we consider to be very foundational legislation, but also reports on this to make it super simple for lawmakers all around the world to do this. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to Tanya Gould. She's going to continue talking about this topic. I have known her for years. She's the director of anti-human trafficking efforts for the state of Virginia, and she's actually a lived experience expert. So please welcome Tanya.